When the 6th German Army surrendered in Stalingrad, the fate of the prisoners. When the 6th German Army surrendered in Stalingrad on January 31st and February 2nd, 1943, approximately 91,000 soldiers were captured by the Red Army. Among them was Friedrich Konrad Winkler, a 34-year-old soldier with multiple distinctions for his combat performance. Detained on February 2nd, he was transferred to the Beketauka prisoner camp, a place where food shortages, disease, and harsh conditions claimed the lives of countless captives. In less than a week, between February 8th and 10th, 1943, Winkler succumbed to malnutrition and lack of medical assistance. His fate was the same as that of more than 86,000 German prisoners in Stalingrad, who never managed to return to their country. Many perished in Soviet camps within the first months of captivity, and their remains were never recovered. The families of these soldiers were left without answers, unaware of their whereabouts or the circumstances of their deaths. Those who had once fought for Germany and the National Socialist regime disappeared in the adversity of captivity, dying on foreign soil without receiving homage or the possibility of ever returning home. The cost of ambition, the invasion of the USSR and its effects on the Germans. On June 22, 1941, at dawn, Adolf Hitler made the decision to launch German troops against the Soviet Union, an act that, in retrospect, sealed the fate of the Third Reich in World War II. His government's objective was not merely to defeat its adversaries, but to annihilate them. The 4 years that followed became one of the bloodiest periods in history, with a high cost in lives both on the battlefield and in the rear, where the systematic extermination of European Jews began. In his obsession with racial supremacy, Hitler gravely underestimated his eastern neighbor, believing that a country he considered inferior would be quickly subdued, just as had happened with Poland, France, and the Netherlands. For his part, Joseph Stalin, a distrustful leader responsible for numerous purges, curiously clung to the belief that Germany would not break the non-aggression pact signed 2 years earlier, despite having first-class intelligence, including that of his spy Richard Sorge, which indicated otherwise. His army, weakened by the purges, was unprepared for the conflict. The consequences of this error were incalculable. Hitler failed to appreciate the vastness of Soviet territory, its industrial capacity, and the number of soldiers that could be mobilized from the farthest regions of the revolutionary power. Anthony Beevor, a renowned British military historian, has argued that Hitler did not learn from the lessons of Napoleon's defeat in 1812 or the Sino-Japanese War of 1937, despite Chiang Kai-shek having German advisors. A defending army, no matter how poorly equipped, can retreat into vast territory, nullifying the attacker's advantages, he noted. In this sense, Hitler's only hope was to turn the invasion into a civil war by recruiting an army of Ukrainians and other opponents of the Soviet regime, but he refused to enlist the Slavs, whom he considered inferior. The numbers speak for themselves. At 3:15 a.m. Berlin time, the German army opened a 2,600-kilometer front, supported by Italian and Romanian allies. A total of 3 million soldiers participated in this offensive, backed by 600,000 horses and vehicles. Peter Fritzsche, author of Life and Death in the Third Reich, highlights that the invasion relied heavily on mobility provided by horses. However, when the Russian winter arrived, this dependence became a critical factor. The German advance was swift. Although in the first 9 months those forces lost approximately 1 million soldiers, a cavalry unit boasted of having killed 200 enemy soldiers and nearly 14,000 civilians. Curiously, some of them, feeling threatened, hid to avoid capture or execution. They often lived in constant fear and sought refuge in forests or abandoned buildings. Reports on this subject are rare, as many of them never returned or disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, the excesses of the German army provoked a patriotic response and a desperate struggle for survival. 3 million Soviet prisoners perished at the hands of the Nazis, 2/3 of them in 1941, many due to starvation. For the officers of that country, fighting fascism was almost the only chance of survival. With the arrival of autumn, the Nazi supply lines began to collapse, trapping tens of thousands of their soldiers, along with their horses and vehicles, in the mud. Soldiers were often captured in large groups under extreme conditions, and a few quickly capitulated or surrendered under the pressure of circumstances. The first ones captured were usually taken to makeshift camps, where they were first registered and then interrogated. The Russian winter rendered part of the enemy's weaponry useless, and the invading troops lacked adequate clothing for the freezing temperatures, as Hitler had underestimated the duration of the offensive. By this point, despite the fact that the Red Army was capturing 10,000 German soldiers monthly, the mortality rate among them was so high that the total number of captives began to decline by the end of 1942. The failure to capture Moscow marked a point of no return. Later, the surrender on February 2, 1943, became a humiliating event for the Wehrmacht. The surrender of the Sixth Army during the Battle of Stalingrad resulted in the capture of approximately 91,000 of the Führer's military personnel by the Red Army, representing a massive military defeat and a profound psychological blow to the Axis war effort. They were taken to Soviet prisoner of war camps, where they had to survive under often extreme conditions. Many of them suffered from hunger, disease, and inadequate medical care. Their capture also had political and propaganda implications, as it was perceived as one of the greatest disasters of the Third Reich, and propaganda sought to obscure reality by blaming the circumstances and the supposed superiority of communist troops. At the same time, a few of the missing were found in the vastness of the Soviet Union, especially in the areas around Stalingrad and in the encirclement battles in Belarus and Ukraine. Mechanisms of control: the Soviet Gulag and its comparison to Nazism. The system of forced labor camps known as the Gulag was one of the most emblematic institutions of the Soviet Union, functioning as a mechanism of political repression and economic exploitation. This complex encompassed a vast network of facilities dedicated to imprisoning and utilizing the labor of millions of individuals, many of whom were considered enemies of the state or simply people who had fallen out of favor under Stalin's regime. The creation of the Gulag dates back to the 1920s, when the first camps were established, the most notable being Solovetsky, inaugurated in 1923. Considered the precursor of Stalin's camp system, it operated until 1939 and housed more than 840,000 prisoners, many of whom were intellectuals, political dissidents, and individuals accused of counter-revolutionary activities. Over time, expansion led to the creation of other large-scale detention centers, such as Demitlag, where by 1934 nearly 200,000 captives were interned, around 23,000 of whom died. Throughout the years, the system expanded significantly, reaching its peak in the following decade, when 476 main camp complexes and approximately 2,000 special settlement colonies were established. The living conditions in these places were extremely harsh. Prisoners were subjected to exhausting workdays in adverse climatic conditions, with temperatures often dropping below zero. Food was scarce and depended on work performance, meaning that those who could not work due to illness, old age, or weakness suffered even more. They had to work or simply did not eat. Rations were minimal, and several inmates suffered from severe malnutrition, contributing to a high mortality rate. For example, during the winter of 1944, in the camp located in the Stalingrad region, the milk supply was reduced by 80% and meat and fat provisions by 20%. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and treatable diseases became death sentences due to the lack of adequate care. Violence was a constant. Guards exercised brutal control over the prisoners, and abuse was common. The lack of solidarity among inmates, exacerbated by competition for limited resources, led to an atmosphere of distrust and desperation. Food thefts were frequent, and the struggle for survival became increasingly fierce. The roles of the inmates varied according to their purpose. There were forced labor camps, transit camps, punishment camps, female and juvenile detention camps, as well as settlements for deported populations. Similarly, camps were created for scientific research and the filtering of individuals considered enemies of the state. From its institutionalization in 1934 under the administration of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs to its gradual dismantling after Joseph Stalin's death, it operated as a central mechanism of state control. But it was not only that, it also played a fundamental role in the country's economy. Prisoners were employed in key sectors such as the timber industry, agriculture, mining, and infrastructure construction. Among the most notable projects were the excavation of the Moscow-Volga Canal, mining operations in Vorkuta, and the construction of the Baikal-Amur railway line. These undertakings relied on the labor of hundreds of thousands under extreme conditions, with a high mortality rate due to labor exploitation, malnutrition, and disease. With the onset of World War II, the structure of the penitentiary system was modified. 2 years later, the Soviet Union had 8 prisoner-of-war camps with a capacity for 50,000 people. 1 year later, 24 additional camps were established. These camps were organized into detention centers located in the rear and battlefront areas. Between 1929 and 1953, approximately 18 million people passed through the forced labor camp system. Of these, around 4.5 million died due to malnutrition, exhaustion, adverse climatic conditions, and punishments imposed within the camps. Deaths were exacerbated by direct orders from Soviet officials, who did not hesitate to execute prisoners without trial, especially German officers. One of the most notorious incidents of this period occurred on July 1, 1941, in Broniki, where one of the first mass executions of these officers took place, as they were shot after being captured. With the collapse of the Third Reich, the vengeance of the Eurasian territory intensified, and in the last months of the war, numerous crimes were committed against German prisoners and civilians, which were tolerated by the Soviet authorities. Although Stalin initially showed no concern over the abuses, the situation changed when reports about the negative impact of violence, aggravated by the soldiers' alcohol consumption, began reaching Moscow. In January 1945, Soviet propaganda adopted a more moderate tone, condemning violence against German women. Although the assaults did not completely cease, once the conflict ended, the government used prisoners of war to rebuild the devastated economy. Around 27 million Soviet citizens, both soldiers and civilians, had died in those 6 years, and the country's infrastructure was severely damaged. In this context, captives were employed in the construction of housing, mining, steel production, and agriculture. The exhaustion caused by the workload, combined with scarce food supplies, significantly reduced their life expectancy. Many died as a result of workplace accidents or physical collapse due to excessive labor. Although the figures varied over the years, it is estimated that at its peak, there were between 40,000 and 50,000 Germans in the camps, most of them prisoners of war or civilians who had arrived in the country during the conflict, with some dying from hunger, disease, and mistreatment. In later decades, measures were implemented for the compensation and rehabilitation of some victims of the Soviet penitentiary system. In 1992, the Russian government passed a law recognizing the injustice committed against these individuals, both local and foreign, who had been sentenced to forced labor without due process. In 2015, the German parliament approved a fund for the compensation of its citizens who had been forced to work in the Soviet Union from the beginning of World War II until 1956. By comparison, Nazi concentration camps, although different in ideology and objectives, shared similarities in terms of living conditions and the treatment of inmates. Those established by Adolf Hitler's regime were intended for the detention of political opponents, Jews, Roma, and other groups considered undesirable. Like in the Gulag system, conditions were inhumane, with food shortages, forced labor under extreme conditions, with many used as labor in the German industry, and a high mortality rate. The Wehrmacht, like the Soviet system, treated prisoners as disposable resources, quickly replacing those who died or fell ill. The lack of medical care and unsanitary conditions led to the spread of diseases, resulting in a high number of deaths. However, the fundamental difference between the two lay in their underlying ideology. While the Gulag focused on political repression and economic exploitation, without death being an objective per se, the Nazi concentration camps were driven by an ideology of racial extermination. The explicit intention of the Nazi regime was to eliminate entire groups of the population, which led to the implementation of systematic extermination programs such as the Holocaust. Extreme cold and long distances, the scorched earth tactic on the Eastern Front. The greatest territorial expansion of the Soviet Union occurred during the years of World War II, establishing its borders so that it was limited to the west by Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Norway. To To the north by the Barents Sea, the Kara Sea, the Laptev Sea, and the East Siberian Sea. To the east by the Sea of Okhotsk, the Bering Sea, and the Pacific Ocean. And to the south by North Korea, the People's Republic of China, Mongolia, Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey. At its peak, it covered approximately 22.4 million square kilometers, representing nearly 1/7 of the Earth's surface. This vast territory extended from west to east, from the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, covering nearly 10,000 kilometers, and from north to south, reaching almost 5,000 kilometers. Likewise, due to its width, it spanned 11 of the world's 24 time zones. In the midst of the conflict, the Wehrmacht had occupied much of the Soviet Union, which naturally led to a massive German presence. Particularly after the defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army launched a large-scale counter-offensive that ultimately led to the reconquest of the occupied territories. These military withdrawals caused some Germans to become trapped there or be forced to retreat, often under violent conditions and accompanied by great human tragedies. It is estimated that millions lost their homes and were forced to flee. The geographical distance between the borders of both countries varied depending on the region, but the main border areas were usually separated by several hundred kilometers. Additionally, the militarization of the border posed a significant obstacle to returning to Germany after World War II, as many Germans were unable to pass migration controls to go back. Those who fell into this situation lived in a state of uncertainty, often not knowing if they would ever return to their homeland or if they would be sent to the Gulag camps. The geography of the Soviet Union was extremely diverse, ranging from eternal ice regions in the north to deserts in Central Asia. The tundra and permafrost of the north represented 8% of its total area, while the deserts and semi-deserts of the south constituted 10%. Forests covered 30% of the territory, and nearly half of the surface was composed of permafrost soils. Only 27% of the territory was arable, a figure lower than the 45% of the United States, and the percentage of cultivated land was 10%, compared to 20% in the US. Many Germans living in the eastern regions had to face various natural barriers such as rivers, mountains, and vast steppes, which made a safe and quick return to their homeland difficult. Some died or were seriously injured in the attempt. Others managed to cross these natural barriers. However, the country's extreme climate, characterized by cold winters and hot summers, complicated life and agricultural production. Russia was divided into 3 climatic zones: the polar zone, where winters were long and dark; the subarctic climate, which covered a vast territory from St. Petersburg to Siberia; the continental climate, which extended from the Baltic coast to Rostov-on-Don. In the Black Sea region, the climate was Mediterranean and subtropical, with mild winters and hot summers. The extreme climatic conditions had a significant impact on military operations, with the Soviets adapting better to the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front compared to their German counterparts. During the summer, heat, water shortages, and clouds of dust exhausted both the troops and their equipment. In autumn, heavy rains and thawing turned unpaved roads into impassable mud pits, where trucks and tanks became stuck. In winter, extreme cold and snowstorms wore down the soldiers on both sides. The Wehrmacht, in particular, was not prepared for winter warfare, and at temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Celsius, engines and automatic weapons failed. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, only the Red Army had adequate clothing for the cold, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers from freezing and exhaustion in unprotected trenches. To this must be added the scorched earth tactic, a strategy that has been used since antiquity, where an army destroys everything that could be useful to the enemy, including roads, railways, factories, agricultural fields, housing, and supplies, accompanied by the forced evacuation of the population and guerrilla warfare against the enemy. Although it was initially prohibited by international law, it was used systematically by both sides, as both the Soviets and the Germans applied this tactic indiscriminately. In the communist case, Stalin ordered its implementation on November 17, 1941, to deprive the Wehrmacht of resources during its advance. The directive from the Red Army's High Command was clear: All settlement points in the rear of the German troops within a depth of 40 to 60 kilometers from the front line must be completely destroyed and burned. On the other hand, after the defeat at Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler instructed the Wehrmacht to leave behind a scorched earth policy during its retreat. On September 7, 1943, Heinrich Himmler ordered that nothing be left standing in the evacuated areas of Ukraine. In March 1945, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, which ordered the destruction of anything that could be useful to the enemy, even within the territory of the Third Reich. Culture and conflict. The experience of immigrants in the Soviet Union. However, not all Germans remained there because of the war. Although in smaller numbers, some genuinely wanted to live there. After 1945, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two world superpowers, alongside the United States. This rise was consolidated through the creation of a socialist bloc in Eastern Europe, where countries under its influence aligned with the principles of communism. It was nothing new. In 2018-1929, it had incorporated parts of eastern Poland, and in 1940 the Baltic states. 7 years later, as a response to the growing tension between that country and the Western Hemisphere, the Cominform was founded, an organization aimed at coordinating communist efforts in Europe and ensuring the loyalty of Allied parties in the countries under its influence. In the nations liberated by the Red Army, communists occupied key positions in government, while leaders of different parties were eliminated through discrediting tactics, intimidation, and political trials. By 1949, countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia were firmly under its control, marking the beginning of an era of ideological domination in the region. In 1955, the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact in response to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, thus marking the start of an intense rivalry that would define much of the Cold War. Despite its status as the victor in the fight against Nazi Germany, its influence in the European and Asian continents, and its role in the United Nations Security Council, the country faced serious economic problems that threatened its stability and growth. The national economy suffered significant losses in those 6 years, with the destruction of infrastructure and the reduction of industrial capacity. Nonetheless, the country managed to recover more quickly than expected, thanks to a series of reconstruction plans and the mobilization of resources. Even so, the centrally planned economy was inefficient and could not provide the variety and quantity of goods the population needed. Store shelves were often empty, and the quality of available goods was often inadequate because production focused more on quantity than quality. Another problem was the distribution of goods. State stores known as Torgsyn or Gossmag often lacked the necessary products in stock, and citizens had to stand in long lines to get what they needed. In countless cases, goods were rationed, meaning people could only buy a certain amount of a product. This led to a panic-buying culture, where people tried to buy as much as possible once a product was available, fearing it would soon run out again, and a thriving black market, where people were willing to pay high prices for products that were not available in official stores. The Soviet Union's immigration policy was not easy, as the government had strict entry controls and requirements, especially for citizens from capitalist countries. However, it did favor those immigrants who were willing to contribute to the country's economic development and identified with the regime's political objectives. It is difficult to accurately quantify the number of Germans and other nationalities who emigrated there, since many had already lived there before the war and tried to return over time. They were the so-called Russian Germans, and they did so mainly for political or economic reasons. However, all those who arrived with fresh revolutionary ideals, hoping for economic stability and the possibility of starting a better life under socialism, encountered the harsh reality described earlier, which did not fulfill the promises of equality and proletarian prosperity. The overall situation of immigrants in the Soviet Union was complex and varied. Although some groups, such as Russian Germans, tried to preserve their language and culture in private, passing down their heritage to future generations, their experiences differed considerably due to repression and the limitations imposed by politics. Additionally, discrimination and stigma were part of their experience in both countries after the fall of the communist regime. For example, they faced prejudice in both their country of origin and their new home, often being considered foreigners due to their unusual accent and their names and surnames, which marked them as deportees or collaborators of one side or another in past events. The migration of specific groups, which was influenced by state policies promoting the relocation and integration of certain groups into Soviet society, often resulted in the marginalization of entire communities. The mobility of the population was also affected by the residence permit system, known as propiska, which limited freedom of movement within Soviet territory, making it difficult to find jobs, obtain housing, and integrate socially, creating barriers for those who wanted to improve their economic situation. From a 1955 decree, the situation became slightly more flexible. They were now allowed freedom of movement and visits to family abroad, but they lost the right to return to their former homes. Additionally, the labor recruitment policy during the 5-year plans sought to boost industrial development, but often resulted in precarious working conditions and worker exploitation. As the Soviet Union neared its collapse, social and economic tensions intensified. The lack of recognition of immigrants' professional qualifications and discrimination in employment access became common problems. Many immigrants, including those of German origin, found that their academic degrees and skills were not valued, forcing them to take jobs below their level of education and their salary expectations. Likewise, the experience of Jewish immigrants was notably complicated. Most faced exclusion from Jewish communities in Germany, as they were considered father Jews and were not fully accepted. The lack of connection with their religious heritage, due to the state's atheist policy, further complicated their social integration. Despite the difficulties, some immigrant groups managed to settle and contribute to cultural diversity, to the point that by 1970, it is estimated that there could have been more than 2 million Russian Germans settled in the communist power. The fall of the regime in 1991 opened new opportunities for cultural exchange and the revitalization of ethnic identities, but Eastern European countries faced the challenge of establishing functional democratic systems and free market economies. The economic reforms, although necessary, led to an increase in unemployment and a social crisis that overwhelmed existing welfare systems. Some citizens began to see these problems as a consequence of democratization, generating a nostalgia for the stability of the socialist era. Crucial decisions in Yalta, the division of Germany and the repatriation of citizens. Between February 4th and 11th, 1945, at the Livadia Palace in Yalta, a meeting was held between the leaders of the major Allied nations of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the United States, Winston Churchill on behalf of the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, met to discuss the political and territorial reorganization of Europe after the conflict. This was the second of 3 conferences these leaders would hold within the framework of the war effort and its resolution, with one of the main topics being the division of Germany after its imminent defeat. It was agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Berlin would be divided into the same 4 sectors. Likewise, the issue of reparations was addressed, with Stalin proposing a sum of $20 billion, half of which would go to his country. However, a definitive agreement on the amount and payment method was not reached, although mechanisms such as the confiscation of machinery, appropriation of patents, and the use of German labor were established. Poland and the shift of borders. Another central point was the situation in Poland. It was determined that the country's eastern border would follow the Curzon Line, which granted the Eurasian giant a considerable territorial expansion. To compensate for this loss, Poland would receive territories in the west. Although the exact delimitation would be defined at a later peace conference, it was agreed that Poland would have a coalition government with the participation of Polish exiles in the west, and that free elections would be held. However, the later imposition of a communist regime generated strong tensions among the Allied powers. Forced repatriation of Soviet citizens. At the conference, it was also agreed to repatriate Soviet citizens who were in territories controlled by the Western Allies. This included prisoners of war, forced laborers, and other displaced persons. The operation was carried out on a large scale and was named Operation Keelhaul. The return of these citizens to the Soviet Union had severe consequences, as many of them were sent to labor camps or executed due to suspicions of collaboration with past and present enemies of the state. In a secret agreement, it was established that all Soviet citizens, regardless of their will, had to be returned to the country. This included people who had fought alongside the Germans in the Eastern Armed Forces, as well as those who had been prisoners of war in Germany. The United Kingdom and the United States complied with this agreement, despite protests from those affected, who feared reprisals from Stalin's government. Legal and ethical violations. The origins of this forced repatriation dated back to September 1944, when a British-Soviet agreement was signed for the return of citizens to their respective countries, regardless of their will. It is worth noting that the implementation of these measures violated traditional principles of international law and asylum rights. Between the last 2 years of the war and the following 2 years, approximately 2.5 million people were forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union by British and American forces. Mass deportation of ethnic Germans. After the start of Operation Barbarossa, a mass deportation of ethnic Germans began. During those 2 years, up to 1.2 million of them were taken from the European parts of the Soviet Union to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Once they arrived, they were separated from local citizens in special settlements under the strict control of a commander, with reporting obligations, travel restrictions, and discrimination. In fact, for a long time, conditions there were similar to those of a Nazi concentration camp. However, on September 13, 1955, a decree was issued that abolished these command posts, which came into effect starting in January of the following year. From then on, Germans were once again allowed to choose where to live within the Soviet Union, except in their former settlement areas. Impact on the British and Americans. The British and Americans were generally less affected, as very few of them had lived in Soviet territory. They numbered only in the thousands, but most were captured during combat on the Eastern Front. However, some British citizens remained in the Soviet Union after the war, fearing possible reprisals for serving either for or against the socialist country, a temporary ally of the UK, or even for having potentially betrayed Britain. The Americans, on the other hand, did not exceed 1,500 individuals. Most of them were captured as a result of military operations in the European theatre, especially against German forces. Their living conditions varied. Some of them were held in camps with relatively decent conditions, where they were provided with basic food and medical care. In contrast, others faced the same precarious conditions as the rest. According to period reports, most of them returned home by the end of 1946, though some repatriation cases were delayed until the early 1950s. Other nationalities affected French prisoners of war were also affected. It is estimated that 920,000 French citizens spent several years in the German military system until the end of the conflict, and more than 23,000 of these individuals were later taken to the Soviet Union. When the repatriation process began, most requested to stay in the country for fear of being tried as war criminals. Other nationalities affected included Japanese, approximately 640,000 individuals who were captured after the defeat of Japanese forces in the Far East. Hungarians, around 513,000. Romanians, 187,000, many of whom had fought on Germany's side before Romania switched to the Allies. Austrians, around 157,000, due to their involvement on the side of Nazi Germany. Czechs and Slovaks, nearly 70,000 since Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Third Reich. Poles, a little more than 60,000, who were captured for having fought against the Red Army. Italians, nearly 49,000, captured after Italy's surrender and the subsequent fighting. Additionally, other nationalities were affected, such as Yugoslavs, Moldovans, Chinese, Koreans, Dutch, Mongols, Finns, Belgians, Luxembourgers, Danes, Spaniards. Some of these groups included individuals who had been recruited or had served in the Axis armies. Challenges to oppression. The history of uprisings in the gulags. Over the decades, the prisoners of the Gulag, who were mostly political dissidents, common criminals, and people considered enemies of the state, faced inhumane conditions that led to multiple uprisings and acts of resistance. The motivations must be evaluated contextually, that is, on a case-by-case basis, but the deplorable living conditions and food shortages were predominant factors. One of the most significant uprisings was that of Ust-Usa on January 24, 1942, which took place in the Komi Republic. It was led by Mark Retunin, an ex-convict and head of a logging camp. The revolt was triggered by rumors of mass executions of prisoners. Retunin and more than 100 inmates of different national origins, and among whom there may have been Germans, mutinied, managed to disarm most of the guards in a detention camp, locked them up and now equipped with winter military uniforms, raided nearby villages, confronting law enforcement forces. Although they managed to free others in similar situations, the uprising was quickly suppressed, and Retunin committed suicide. The security forces suffered 33 casualties, while the rebels had 42 deaths during the revolt and 50 death sentences. Another notable mutiny was that of Norilsk, between May 26 and August 4, 1953, where more than 16,000 captives in a mountainous camp declared a general strike following multiple executions by the guards. Various categories of inmates participated, notably former military personnel and members of national liberation movements from Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Georgia. Although in smaller proportion, there may have been Asians from different regions, Germans and Italians. The prisoners demanded an end to the law of the strongest, a change in leadership, and improvements in living conditions. Although the administration made some concessions, the strike continued for nearly 70 days, becoming the longest in Gulag history. It ended when the authorities stormed the camp, resulting in 150 deaths. This event occurred before the arrest of the first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union, Lavrentiy Beria, and its repression coincided with the news of his arrest. It was also encouraged by Stalin's death on March 5th and the subsequent amnesty that only benefited non-political criminals and convicts with short sentences, a scarce group in Gulag. However, for the German captives in these camps, the fundamental factor was the information they received about the uprising in the German Democratic Republic, which reached its peak on June 17th. It occurred due to high reparation payments to the Soviet Union, which placed considerable pressure on the national economy. At its second party conference in July 1952, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany decided on the planned construction of socialism, which meant prioritizing heavy industry over consumer goods production. These policies led to a decline in the standard of living and a food crisis because the population's needs were not properly addressed. Another crucial factor was the 10.3% increase in labor standards in May, while wages remained unchanged. Many perceived this as an additional burden, leading to widespread discontent among workers. In the preceding days, there had already been protests at construction sites in East Berlin, where workers demonstrated against this increase in standards. The discontent continued to grow, and on June 15th and 16th, 1953, workers from several construction sites in East Berlin began to strike. By the following day, more than 700 cities and towns across the country were involved in the strike, with more than 1 million people from all social classes participating. They demanded the annulment of the labor standards increase, political reforms leading to free elections, the reunification of Germany, and the replacement of the party leadership under Walter Ulbricht. The response from the SED leadership was drastic. A state of emergency was declared in several regions, and Soviet troops and the People's Police were mobilized to suppress the uprising. Authorities used tanks to crush the demonstrators. It is estimated that around 50 people were killed and thousands were arrested. Although it was crushed within days, it remains an important event and is often considered the first major resistance against the communist regime in Eastern Europe, thus motivating their fellow countrymen in the Gulag system to rebel against communism. The Kengir uprising between May 16th and June 26, 1954, was equally significant. In a camp in the Kengir steppe, Kazakhstan, more than 5,200 prisoners mutinied after a guard executed 13 inmates and the arrival of around 650 thieves who integrated into the camp. The presence of the latter led to an unexpected alliance between them and the political prisoners. The rebels, which included Ukrainians, Balts, Russians, Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Americans, and Spaniards, took control of the camp for a month. They demanded, among other things, the review of their cases, an 8-hour workday, the lifting of restrictions on correspondence, and the punishment of the guards responsible for the murders. The thieves, supported by political prisoners, began taking control of the establishment, breaking barriers, and fighting against the guards. In the initial clashes, several guards were injured or killed, forcing the administrators to flee. The prisoners took advantage of this opportunity to occupy the camp and establish a sort of republic in which they set up their own administration and enjoyed basic freedoms. However, the movement was suppressed on June 26 by Soviet army and police units using tanks, resulting in nearly 700 deaths and injuries. In general terms, the government's response to these revolts was violent and somewhat disorganized, as the Gulag administration did not know exactly how to handle peaceful strikers. The most commonly employed method was characterized by a Stalinist reflex, where those responsible attempted to arrest and isolate perceived instigators to demoralize and end the strikes. Once overwhelmed, the uprisings did lead to some changes in the camps, albeit limited. The internal camp regime was slightly relaxed, allowing inmates to write letters and receive packages. On the other hand, the visit of the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Konrad Adenauer, to Moscow in September 1955 resulted in the release of around 9,616 prisoners and more than 20,000 civilians interned. The negotiations were full of tension, as their communist counterparts initially claimed that there were no more prisoners of war, only war criminals. However, after several days of intense negotiations and a threat of breaking off talks, a major breakthrough was finally achieved. Soviet leaders, led by Nikita Khrushchev, gave their word of honor that the captives and interned civilians would be released. The agreement was not put in writing, which left some uncertainty, but Adenauer was able to return home with the result. After his visit, repatriations began between October 1955 and January of the following year.